Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Crysler. Each episode, we talk to business leaders and subject matter experts to learn about the challenges they've overcome and the challenges they still face. You'll hear fresh insights, real talk, and get inspiration to grow your business. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us on another episode of the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. Today, I am joined by Mike O'Neill, who is the founder of Bench Builders. Mike's an executive coach who works with senior leaders that need a trusted advisor, not just a sounding board, someone who'll push back when it matters most. He's also the host of Get Unstuck and On Target, where I was recently a guest myself, so appreciate that, Mike. And a lot of his clients live in the same world that we talk about here, which is manufacturing. So, Mike, thanks so much for coming on the Everyday Business Problems Podcast.
It's good to be with you, Dave.
Yeah, appreciate it, man. We've had some really good conversations leading up to this, and appreciate getting to know you and the work that you do, and certainly some overlap, but we definitely come at it from a different perspective. But I've enjoyed learning about your background and the things that you're up to. So again, appreciate you taking the time.
You bet.
Yeah, cool. So I'm curious to kind of kick off the conversation here. Your company's called Bench Builders and not O'Neill Executive Consulting or Coaching. So what's the story behind the name and why that specific name?
I think it probably starts with I'm a sports fan, and therefore I immediately think of if you've got a sports team, you've got your starters out there, but your team is only as good as the strength of your bench. And you know that my background is HR. I spent 25 years in corporate HR, and of all the things that HR gets involved with, and they touch every aspect of a company, what I found is preparing people for their future roles was so key to success. So when I started my own business, I kind of keyed in on it. So our areas of service kind of falls into three categories. We help companies from an advisory standpoint. We do training, particularly supervisory training. And then the coach role is mine. It's kind of a side role, but it's become more what defines what I do more of now.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense. And I don't know if we've talked about, your love for sports. Maybe we have, but I don't recall that as being like a hot button. So that is good to know. And certainly, one of the things that caught my eye in terms of, some of those early conversations that we had, because I think, especially in manufacturing, there's lots of examples to pull from where, really amazing operators, have been promoted into that, some level of leadership, and often, on their own with not a lot of support. And so I think that's, where my mind kind of naturally went, when we first got connected. And so I want to dive into that in a bit, but to kind of get to that point, one of the things as I was preparing for the show that, I was really thinking about, and I think you'll have some really great insight into this, but, because of that coaching and the one-on-one work that you're doing from that senior leadership perspective, what are some of the things that you end up hearing from those executives, those senior leaders that maybe, they have a harder time sharing in front of their team? I think there's this connection point potentially that if they could learn to open up and make those conversations a little bit more transparent, where that could ultimately take the organization. But I'm curious to hear from your perspective. Are there things that you hear consistently across the folks that you're coaching that, they feel comfortable to share with you, but maybe not as comfortable to share in front of the team?
Yeah, several things kind of come immediately to my mind. And let's just start with what may be a worn out adage, but it truly is lonely at the top. And by that, I mean, as one grows in the organization, if you're a founder, you've always been at the top. But if you came into the organization and rose to the top, what oftentimes happens is if you're not careful, you're surrounding yourself with people who know what you want to hear, and that's all you hear. And so what I have found is that it's tough. Leading others is hard. Owning a company is hard. But what we kind of tell ourselves is we're supposed to kind of get stern and look like you're in total control all the time. And the reality is most people struggle with that at times. And so what I would say to you, the first thing that comes immediately to my mind is leaders oftentimes get walled off. Who can they turn to? If they're publicly held, they really can't go to their board. They may not feel comfortable talking to their direct reports. They surely can't talk to their peers. So that isolation is one in which they're smart people. They've accomplished a lot.
Yeah.
So I'm not there to challenge that at all. But at the same time, they may be surrounded by people who don't challenge them at all. And therefore, as I see my role, it's first and foremost to give them a space just to be themselves. So, Dave, I'm not a counselor. I'm not a therapist. I don't pretend to be. I don't get into those types of things. But as a leader, there are so many things that a leader has to deal with every day that you cannot read about anywhere. You have to experience it. And I think what I hope I do in my role as a coach is listen well, but with trust, they begin to say, these are things I'm kind of wrestling with. So most of the things we work on are how can they become more effective leaders? But to do that, they've got to be willing to kind of drop that guard down a little bit because we're working on new behaviors that when you try it out, it doesn't always work the first go around. So I try to give them a safe space to do it, but I don't let them off the hook.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, what's interesting about that and kind of a counterpoint to it is, I think, and this goes back to when I was coming up in leadership, I think when you're in the outer circle, so to speak, right, it's easy to kind of second guess with the information that you have at hand, right? Because you're not seeing the full picture. You're seeing whatever, part or area of responsibility that you are, and you're often isolated from that, right? And I think kind of, counterintuitively is the same, right? Even though you are ultimately responsible. And as I ascended into leadership, I kind of learned that quickly, right? There are things that, there are no other folks that you can really turn to in that scenario. But my question back to you in the work that you do is, what would you say to the folks that are on the outside looking in and kind of second guessing some of those maybe leadership decisions or, maybe lack of feedback loop? What would you kind of say, if you had those folks in the room in terms of like what that isolation kind of costs those senior leaders?
So if I understand the question, you're asking, what would I tell those that these senior leaders are leading?
Yeah.
That's interesting. I think if you're higher up in the organization, the reality is they probably have seen the same themselves. They are leaders. And so I would just try to use their frame of reference. Do you find that there are folks around you who might not shoot as straight as you'd want them to? And if the answer is yes, then I would say, then that applies to the boss as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. And I think it's a good, it's ultimately a good frame to kind of base things around. I often said to the folks that, and again, this came years after I was leading teams, but, as I transitioned and was mentoring other leadership folks, I kind of used the phrase that we're always just dealing in perceptions. right? There's obviously reality, but when we are leading other people, we are really managing their perception of reality, right? And I think that kind of what we were saying, in the sense that everybody has that isolated view that influences whatever that perception happens to be. And I find myself having a lot of conversations with folks these days around having more transparent conversations, and I think that it's easy to say and really challenging to do. But it sounds like, you're encouraging similar things, from your perspective back to, getting into these new habits and really flexing those muscles. Are there any ways or exercises that you kind of recommend or routinely promote to help folks kind of get out of that comfort zone and get into the, not just the practice, but I would say probably like the right mindset of how to approach, those conversations, or, the being uncomfortable doing the uncomfortable thing, I would say.
Let me see if I can kind of give you a little bit of a setting and answer your question. As I was thinking about your question, I was trying to think, what is the most common reason that people would reach out and say, Mike, let's talk? And more often than not, it's because they're in some form of transition. They're in a leadership transition, and they're moving into a more senior role. To keep it simple, they are considering or are moving into a C-suite role.
Got it.
And at least in my experience, I don't know if this is what you find, is that the mistake they make is that the C-suite is just one more part of the progression. If I just do this a little differently, this a little bit differently, I'll do just fine. And what I find and what many find is the C-suite is a whole new ballgame.
Yeah.
You've just stepped into a role where everybody's watching. You just step into the role where everybody just assumes that you know what you're talking about. You just step into the role that every decision you make has consequences. So to answer your question of how that would work is you have to understand what that role entails. And to do that, you really have to start with understanding yourself. So my practice from a coaching standpoint is the first thing that we do together is we get to know each other well, and particularly who I'm working with, they get to know themselves as to how they are hardwired. So I use an assessment that asks these series of questions that gives them very thorough feedback on how they naturally lead, how they think, how they communicate, because those are their God-given abilities. And then, with their permission, I speak to those around them. I have a set of questions I ask. And these are people who are around them, who report to them, who perhaps they report to. It is what I would refer to as a verbal 360. And what I do is I compile that information and I put it in a report I call a leadership scouting report. And what that does is when we sit down, is that very early stage, that first day that we meet, they have a clearer understanding, usually an affirmation of who they are based on the assessment. Now we also have how they perceived by others. And if there's strong alignment, they see themselves the same way others, that's one thing. But more often than not, there's disconnect. And it's that disconnect, and I hope this is making sense, but it's that disconnect. I thought I was being perceived this way to find out otherwise. That usually is what they identified that they want to work on. They want to close that gap. So you ask, what would be the tricks? I don't really use tricks per se, but what I would say is if they understand it from their own assessments, from feedback that they trust, they don't know who said what.
Sure.
Then if they're willing to say, you know what, I want to close that gap, then what we do is talk about, well, what would closing look like? How would you know you're doing that? So everything we do together is going to be measured. We literally create a scorecard. So if you kind of wrap all it up together, I try to appeal to a senior leader the way they run their business. They run their business with scorecards, I'm going to use the exact same thing with them. The key is it's their scorecard. It's not me reporting them.
Yeah.
And as a result, the things that might come from that might vary. But as a general rule, we focus on the things that are causing the most problems first, get those knocked out, and then we're off to the races.
Yeah. No, I love that. I mean, one of the questions I had jotted down, which, even though my question didn't really start there, I think you answered well. And, it was the question I had jotted down was just, what's the difference between, kind of being that sounding board and being a trusted advisor? And I think you unpack that well from the perspective of oftentimes I think coaching, generally speaking, gets a bad rap. And I think it gets that bad rap or has more of a negative connotation for a lot of folks because they think that, coaching equals like sounding board friend, some sort of ineffective tool, if you will, to really move the needle or close gaps, all of those things. And, so I really appreciate what you had to say there in terms of kind of walking folks through what that really looks like and how, an effective coach. And again, I know folks kind of say like, oh, professional athletes, the Tiger Woods, one of the greatest golfers of all time, always had a coach, right? So there's certainly those types of examples to pull from. But I think in the business world, there's so many different forms, and there's a lot of folks that maybe don't have the practical expertise, to kind of back that up. So again, I appreciate you, kind of diving into that and answering that question before I even asked it. So.
Well, good. I'm glad.
Yeah, no, it's good. I think, it's a great segue into another thought I had, and it was something that you had on the website that I jotted down, and it's a phrase that you have on there is, as the stakes rise, clarity gets harder to find. And I think what's interesting about that and why it resonated with me and why I think it will resonate with the folks that are tuning into this is because, from my perspective, all things can be tied back to clarity, right? And I think it's so simple yet so challenging because there's back to what we were saying in terms of dealing in perceptions, right? You've got levels of clarity based on what you know to be true, yes. Right? And I think when we ascend through those leadership ranks, because that is changing, because, the C-suite has a different purview of the business than, a general manager, than a department lead, than a team lead, right? I think that's always changing. So I'd love to know from your perspective, like how you start to talk about that with the folks that you're engaged with and even just more broadly helping people to understand clarity from your perspective. How do you get there, if you will, with the different folks that, that come along with running and leading an organization?
I'll make a stab at this. If you step back and look at a typical day in a senior leader's life, it's crazy. It's easy to end the day and it's just kind of a blur. So from a clarity standpoint, what's important is not so much for me to be clear, it's more important for them to be clear. And that is, are they clear on where they're trying to take the organization? Are they clear on what their role is in taking the organization there? Do the people who report to you know what their role is? If not, what do we need to do to improve that? So the focus is on whoever I'm spending time with is that it's got to be crystal clear in their mind of what is it they're trying to accomplish. And then we literally go through what needs to happen for that to take place. And so as important as clarity is, and it's foundational to start with, what I have found is, but they've got to see momentum. They got to see direction. They got to see progress towards. So I try to marry clarity with execution. what have you effectively executed on that you clearly define you want to do?
Yeah.
And when you are able to hit both of those things, it's an engine, if you would. As they execute and accomplish that, then they can move on to the next thing. But it has to be, it's not just let's get together and talk. It is, what do you want to solve? Let me see if I can help you solve it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think oftentimes, folks in leadership kind of move between clarity and accountability, and can sometimes, in my mind, pass right over consistency. And I think the root of it ends up still being back to the clarity issue, right? It's one of those things where I like to ask the question, let's just plainly articulate, like, what does success look like? Right. I can't tell you how many owners and leaders I've talked to that have direct reports that are frustrated with ultimately the output. And when you ask that very simple question, just tell me, what does success look like? And then the next question is, well, where is that documented? How have we, set that expectation with whomever we are frustrated with? Right. And inevitably, there tends to be a gap between those things, right? Mm-hmm. And so we want to jump to that accountability piece without necessarily, defining the clarity. And again, clarity sets the tone for consistency. And yes, at the end of the day, sometimes accountability is a piece of this because you find people that either don't have the skill set and you can upskill them or move them. And some people, don't ultimately rise to that occasion, right? But yeah, I totally agree with you in terms of getting that set up and trying to continue to focus on that, using that as the ultimate, pivot point for people. I'm curious from your perspective too, and you talked about it at the start of the episode with kind of the three legs or service lines of the business. One of those being leadership development, right? And so I'm curious with your work if you find a lot of companies are focused on one level maybe of the organization, and what does that do ultimately to the rest of the leadership folks? Do you see people or companies rather that are more focused on investing at that C-suite level and kind of remaining hopeful that it just trickles down to the rest of the org? Or is that something where you see holistic investment across the board with orgs that are starting to think about how to upskill their leadership folks and to your point, build the bench?
This may surprise you, but one of the reasons why I was drawn to supervisor training versus quote management training or director training is, at least in my experience, most companies do a very poor job preparing their line supervisors to lead others. They identify people who are really good in individual roles. They out there and they're hustling. They got drive, and they name them supervisor. And they just assume that they know what it takes to be a successful supervisor. At least in my experience, the hardest transition for anybody is going from being a peer to being a supervisor. Yeah. There's so many things that go into that get overlooked. So what we have done is we've decided to focus primarily on first line supervisory training. And I'll tell you why. As a business owner, it is the thing that most companies don't do well, if they do it at all. Because if you think about it, some of the topics sound a little bit boring, but they're absolutely essential. What I find, most companies, they'll say, oh, yes, we develop our people. But if you look at it, it's usually technical training.
Yeah.
It is usually the things that you can say, yeah, we're doing that. But when you roll up the sleeves and you talk about what does a supervisor have to do to be successful, they just gloss over it. So we lean into that. And what we have found is that when you do that, when a company says, you know what, we're going to resist the temptation to start at the top, we're going to go all the way to the bottom, what they find is we take those first line supervisors through training, and lo and behold, they see results. But the reality is those first line supervisors get promoted to the next level and the next level and the next level. And what happens is they never got the foundational skills and they're out there winging it.
Yeah.
So what has happened is, though I describe our sweet spot as first line supervisors, the reality is at least 2 levels above the first line supervisor, they never got what we're covering in these classes. And so if you were able to kind of slip them into that, you can help them get it. And so that has kind of broadened our core offer. The series I'm describing is called Build Your Bench. It's fundamental 2-hour modules built on the previous. And that series is purposely designed to introduce the supervisor to everything that they might encounter as a supervisor, literally from hire to fire. And that's literally the first and the last modules. And because companies realize if they did a poor job with first line supervisor, they're doing nothing to prepare people for that first role. So we got another series, which is new to the bench. So what I would say is, what do companies typically do? They typically go for the more sexy topics, and they lose sight of where the real bang for the buck is.
Yeah.
And I'm biased, admittedly, but when you have a supervisor who doesn't have those skills in place, they've got good technical skills, but they don't have the people skills. They don't have the managerial skills they need to run things. It shows up in everything they do. Your employee turnover is inevitably going to be higher when you don't invest in those first line supervisors. Things like safety in a manufacturing setting is it takes discipline to have an effective safety program. If you don't have a disciplined supervisor who knows that there's proper ways of doing everything, including safety, but it shows up there. It shows up in so many different ways. Companies who do surveys, where they go out and do surveys of their employees, find that those supervisors who are good at supervising, their numbers always are much better. Yeah. So my bias is focus on where the biggest payoff is. It's first line supervisors. And that's what's kind of informed the vast majority of our training. It's those first 3 levels within the organization.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, I think, this has been, I don't want to quite call it a universal problem, but, it's been around for a long time. Let's say it that way. I'm curious if you have any insights or opinion on, what the genesis of it is. Like, what do you think is driving companies to continue to perpetuate that? Because I think, all of the organizations I came up in, I can tell you, we didn't focus on that, building the bench. And it was trial by fire. And, I've told my own story of saying, I'll never forget what it was like to, have my first real, kind of supervisory position where it was like, I knew what I was there for while simultaneously having no idea what I was supposed to be doing, and it wasn't because we didn't have effective top level leadership, but they were not equipped to bring somebody brand new into that environment and articulate what the day-to-day actions looked like to ultimately be successful. It was kind of like you sink or swim. And I'm just curious, with all of the work and engagements that you've done, if you have any insights as to what drove, what has driven that and what continues to drive that for orgs versus not thinking through this as a wise, investment.
Dave, I made the assumption that smaller companies won't do it just because they just don't have the bandwidth to do it. You ask why don't they do it? It's my sense they don't do it because they don't know how to do it. Or if they know how to do it, they're not going to have the discipline to build the training in a way that really works best for them. So it just doesn't get done. And so, in doing this for quite some time, when we began working with a company and we get to know them very well, and we particularly get to know leadership, HR leadership, and top leadership, what happens pretty early on is they'll say, Mike, we should have done this a long time ago. They know they should have done it, but they didn't do it. The thing that surprised me is that companies much, much larger. I've worked in the automotive industry. I won't name company names, but company names, major corporations actually don't do what I'm describing well either.
Yeah.
So I've had the good fortune to work with small manufacturers and work with very large manufacturers. And it's the same issue. The difference is these large manufacturers, they've got staff that could go build all this. But what oftentimes happens is they bring us in, they think that they're going to at least learn from us and then start doing it themselves. And what they find is, why would we do something that these folks are really best at? We got bigger things to worry about. And so that is why we've been so fortunate to work with companies for a long period of time, because there's always going to be, if it's growing, always new people coming into the roles.
Yeah.
And so if you do it right, it just becomes just part of, this is how we do things. And you mentioned earlier in the conversation about how critical it is to have correct processes that are documented. Well, what we find is when we begin talking about interviewing and onboarding, when we start talking about dealing with conflict or corrective action, many of these things require very good defined processes and documentation. And it's surprising how companies don't do that. So what they get with us is not only good training, but they get almost a turnkey process that can be easily tailored to who they are. And so what you see these HR leaders doing is they start putting more than one check mark on these things. So I know I am biased by my answer here, but what I would say is most companies don't do it because they don't know how to do it. But when they do, they scratch their heads and they start saying, why didn't we do this a long time ago?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a good insight. Ultimately, right, all of these things that kind of exist in the world, it's easy when you're, on the practitioner side to look at and say, or to, put into the bucket of, people should be doing these things, right? To me, right, you mentioned process document. Like, to me, it makes zero sense, right, that we have environments, big or small, right? Mm-hmm. And to your point, have been in both, that it doesn't exist. And, similar problem sets, right? Big company, small company. But I think ultimately, just like the work that I do, it's the companies that are, actively looking to grow, to improve, that have these types of programs on their radar, that are interested in building, maintaining, this culture. And I know that's a word that gets thrown around a lot and very loosely at times. But these are the types of things that when you talk about being people-centric, mm-hmm. And you're not doing the things that Mike is talking about, right? It becomes very challenging to kind of prove that you're people-centric if you are not actively engaging in, participating, investing in people, right? So it becomes lip service I think, for a lot of folks. So one of the things I wanted to ask you too, Mike, more specific about, because you had mentioned the program that you guys do for frontline leaders, but maybe you can, and hopefully this isn't giving away too much, but I'm curious, like, how what are the activities ultimately that kind of get done in between the learning elements that help to reinforce the things that folks are learning? Are there, you don't have to give away the whole thing, but I'm curious if you can talk about maybe one or two, kind of practical things that folks are going out and executing against to maybe reinforce the learning that that is happening in some of these sessions.
So, Dave, what I'm going to share with you is it's so practical. People kind of go, well, wait, what are you saying? We stick to real practical. So let me start with, what does a participant in our training experience? What they're going to experience is something they can immediately relate to. We're not going to be talking theory. We're going to be talking about practical. When we give examples, we're going to be given examples that literally are drawn from their own environment. So there's no new terminology to learn. So it starts, I hate to use the term classroom, but if you allow me to use it, it starts when we all come together. We're coming together, and for many of these folks, this is the first time they've ever been brought in a room with their peer group to do anything other than get lectured or some type of rah-rah speech. And what they're finding is, when you bring people together and you immediately, right out of the blocks, share with them things that they can relate to immediately. That's key. Secondly, it's understood that talking about it in a classroom is not the game. Taking what we're learning, hopefully it's a good experience, and applying it immediately is key. So we do the things that work best. We talk about it, and then we talk about how that applies in their setting. And then we do some variants of role play in the classroom. For us, we don't pull one person in front of the whole class and put them on the spot, but we break into small groups. So we give them safe space to try things. And so when they begin doing that, they have very explicit, these are the steps we want you to practice. They know when they leave in that class that they're going to be expected to go practice it. They know that they're going to be expected to talk about what their experience was like at the beginning of the next session. So what I would say is, you mentioned the accountability, is if the thought is you can come and sit through it, no. You're going to need to be actively engaged. What you're going to be engaged with is something that you can relate to, because when you leave in the next hour, it's going to be real. We just talked about what you're experiencing. And you're expected to go do it and be willing to come back and share with somebody that they might not have had in the past. You're building peers. You're building relationships. The colleges call them cohorts. But when that group comes together and they meet on a regular basis over a period of time, the connections that take place there is undeniable. The trust that begins to be built across departmental lines, across divisional lines, all of a sudden barriers start to come down. Now, it may sound like I'm overselling first-line supervisory training, but that's what really does happen. And guess what? The organization notices it.
Yeah.
And when you mentioned that word culture, I try not to throw that word around too loosely, but culture in my mind is, you could say it. It can be on a poster, but culture really is, what behavior can you observe that reinforces what is it you say you're all about?
Yeah.
So everything we're talking about right now is measurable. We're going to try new behaviors. Some will work, some won't. We'll come back, we'll acknowledge that it was a little tough, get better at it, and then move on. And the intent here is, over time, the trust, the awareness, the willingness to try new things, what inevitably happens is their next level up starts saying, hey, I want to be in there. And so that's how they get invited into the process. They're seeing that the people they manage are picking up on things they wish they had.
Yeah.
And so what do? We don't demean them by saying you never got it. We bring them in and say, as their manager, here are behaviors we want you to reinforce. And in asking them to reinforce it, they're learning it. Does that comment make sense?
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
I mean, ultimately, there is no better, kind of reinforcement or way to learn than doing.
Yes.
So, you can certainly learn additional techniques. You can, talk about it. You can role play. But there is no substitution for getting out and doing the thing and learning through, those taking those reps, if you will. Mm-hmm. I think anybody that says otherwise is certainly misdirecting you. So, yeah, Mike, this has been great. I mean, hard to believe we've already chatted here for nearly 40 minutes. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you feel compelled to share with folks?
Maybe not about me and about what we do, but what I can tell you, Dave, you and I have had conversations off camera, off mic. And what I've learned about you is there's so much of what I just described that is who you are. That's kind of just how you look at it. And I guess what I would say is I don't think there's anything that I described, perhaps not anything that you do, that is rocket scientist.
Yeah.
But it's intentionality. And what I would just say to you is what you do, and I'm confident you do very well, is you help them get clear on what they want to do. If there's a system or process, you help them make sure that that is the right system, the right process, and there's adherence to it. It is fundamentals. It's focusing on those things. But when you get those things down, it shows in so many other ways. I hope what you've heard in my description is a bit of a parallel. And that is the things that I'm describing, it's just good common sense executed well. And when that happens, what they see is they see turnover go down. Turnover is very expensive. They see the sense of we belong go up. You see people and teams working better together. So what I would just say to you is I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. You can tell I get kind of excited about this, and I hope I didn't come across as too over the top here.
No, it's all good, man.
But I appreciate the opportunity. I wouldn't add anything other than keep doing what you're doing. I've listened to a number of your episodes. I love the whole premise. Keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And no, I've enjoyed the conversations. And I think to just, tack on a bit to what you were saying, one of the things that I think makes it, to your point, none of it is rocket science, right? But it is repetition and experience. And the reason that it appears to be so simple and that we try to get it to its lowest common denominator, I believe is due to that experience. And I know personally, and maybe you would agree or not, but, personally speaking, I know I couldn't do what I do today had I not been in all of the organizations that I had I not made all of the mistakes that I did make, had I not thought through all of the different, complex frameworks and, terminology and all of the other ways that we overcomplicate the stuff we're ultimately talking about. Right. And I think that's what I appreciate about our conversations, even outside of this conversation, is that, there's a real synergy from the perspective of just saying, it's the fundamentals. It's creating clarity. It's being consistent. It's obviously having, accountability in that. But it's bringing people along, and it's showing up empathetically. It's, addressing difficult things head on. And not being afraid of that. And ultimately, making some mistakes along the way, as we all do in the process of learning and growing. So with that, I would welcome you to share, anybody that wants to reach out and connect with you, Mike, where's the best place for them to do that at?
Probably the most straightforward would be through our website. The name of the company is Bench Builders, but the website is bench-builders.com. And I'm active on LinkedIn. I think that's how you and I cross paths to begin with. Reach out. It's Mike O'Neill, Oneill. I would love to connect. And if I can be of any help to your viewers, your listeners, I'm happy to help any way I can.
Yeah, perfect. And I'll make sure to put those links in the show notes for folks so they can find that stuff easily. Mike, thanks so much for coming on the Everyday Business Problems podcast.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you, David.
Thank you so much for listening today. If we brought you any value, please rate, subscribe, and share our podcast. Also, be sure to connect with us on social media by searching @The Crysler Club. Until next week, I'm your host, Dave Crysler.